books. I mean, you can read all the articles you want. You can listen to all the podcasts you want. At the end of the day, the only way you really get a feel of what's possible and how this is changing is you kind of have to get hands-on. And so if you want to get hands-on a bit and do some experimentation, but you don't want to ship it into production, all right, yeah, that very well, if you're a more conservative company, that very well may be the right call to make. But if you're just waiting to really like dip your toe in at all, I think you're on a serious risk of just being behind conceptually in how business is changing.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing Podcasts. Here's Kevin.
I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. I also run a bunch of other businesses, including an agency Did It, and an incubator that has a bunch of technology being built, including some Martech technology and sales tech technology. So super excited to be catching up with Scott Brinker once again. I think must be 5 or 6 years since we did our last podcast, but the timing is apropos because you've got the state of Martech coming out and the new marketing technology landscape. So for those folks who don't know, which is probably nobody listening, what was the catalyst for you deciding to create the landscape back when it would fit on a sheet of paper?
Yes, back when you could actually read those logos. So I created it originally at a search marketing conference back 2010, 2011, simply trying to persuade marketing executives how much they were becoming dependent on technology for delivering on their vision, their strategy, all the things they wanted to do, really as a way to try and persuade them to invest a little bit more in developing the technical talents, the marketing ops talents on their team. So, it's just sort of putting together a landscape of, by the way, this is probably the, range of things that you already have in your department today. Who's running all of this for you?
So it's obviously exploded at the category and subcategory level. I'm sure that you've had steam coming out of your ears as you try to decide even which of the categories some of these folks belong in. It's some of the similar problem that Terry Kawaja had with the Lumascape as people kept moving into the tangential boxes and solving more than one problem, at least ostensibly at the same time. So, how does that layer into the challenge for the CMO and CRO as they go through and make decisions? It seems like the complexity now is orders of magnitude greater than it was, even 5 years into your chart.
Yeah, it is definitely a complex space. Although, in all fairness, this isn't just marketing. This is pretty much every sector on the planet. Like, there's 15,000 some odd marketing technology solutions we've mapped. But that landscape is dwarfed. Like, if you're in finance, the number of solutions that are out there in the fintech world is about twice, 3 times that. If you're a developer, like the whole dev tech space is crazy. So, yeah, I guess you can take some small comfort. It's not just us in marketing sales. It's just software in the 21st century. And boy, now with AI, it's probably getting even crazier. So for executives, marketing executives, though, honestly, as proud as I am of that marketing technology landscape, I would strongly recommend not looking at it. It's just not the place to start. In many ways, that landscape is at best sort of a thermometer of the industry, the sector in the MarTech space. But when you're a marketing executive, you never want to start with the technology, right? You want to start with, what's the strategy? Who are we trying to serve? What are the capabilities we need to be competitive? By the time you get to having to evaluate specific technologies to execute on that, you're not looking at a landscape of 15,000. You're almost certainly in a position where you can narrow it down to relatively short list of qualified vendors.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, Did It started in SEO before Google was even founded, right? And so now, with GEO or AIO or whatever you choose to call it, the visibility game is even more complex. And, to your earlier point about the CMOs sort of figuring out what problems they're really trying to solve and what their overarching strategy is, yeah, a lot of they're going to move towards asking probably an LLM for advice, right? And it's completely changed what the CMOs of these companies in your chart need to think about from a visibility perspective. So, um, do you feel like there's still room with a SaaS apocalypse for the new players to move in, or do you think it's what's your point of view on sort of that craziness of um, being in somebody's consideration set, right? How do you end up to be one of the five or six players that make it into the final round?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this was the first year that the Martech landscape effectively flattened out. Like last year we tracked 15,384 solutions. This year it was only 15,505. So for all those people who are wondering, will we ever hit peak Martech? Arguably, we have hit peak Martech, and it's entirely possible that it is the peak from which things may decline, not because Martech is becoming any less important, but because even the very nature of what we're doing with Martech is changing so much. My thesis is that the market is going to bifurcate, and on one side you will have really commercial MarTech is infrastructure more than anything else. These primary platforms, data systems that we use that nobody wants to vibe code. That'd be a big mistake to like vibe code your own cloud data warehouse or something like that. These like foundational systems, but just like that announcement from Salesforce where they did their whole Salesforce headless 360, these platforms are going to be less and less about the UI for how individual marketers are working with them and more about a set of capabilities that, yeah, there may be a UI to get to it, but honestly, a lot of the interaction might be happening through like other AI assistants or autonomous agents or whatnot that those marketers want to use. And I think that market by its nature is going to lend itself to, I'll say, relative consolidation. Like I still think we're going to be looking at hundreds of players there, but compared to 15,000, I think it'll be relatively consolidated. But then on the other end, I certainly think we're going to see people building more and more of their own specific little apps and experience and workflows, this whole vibe coding thing. We can make a little bit of fun of it, but sort of extrapolate where things are headed. People are just going to be building a lot of these things because they can tailor something specific to their business, their need, their customer. But who knows? I can totally imagine there being marketplaces out here where people who come up with their cool particular app or agent or capability make it available to others. And none of those things are going to become like $100 million, SaaS companies. They're not going to get VC funding, anything like that. But could there be this very robust landscape of, I don't know, almost like there used to be plugins for WordPress, of things out there that becomes a long, long, long tail of things that, oh, we can build our own or we can pull this off the shelf. And I don't know. That's a thesis.
Yeah, I mean, it will be fascinating to watch because I think, the allure of vibe coding is, oh, there's no technical moat. I could, recreate something that exists or I could create something entirely new. But, there are almost always maintenance issues associated with that. And it's not, set it and forget it or build it and they will come, or it's, you're not ever done. Like everything I've created under my incubator, variousventures.com has been sort of dealing with a moving target, right? Because you build it
Yeah.
and you get feedback from customers and you have to adapt it and change it. So I would agree with you that even folks with the resources to potentially vibe code replacements for some of their SaaS platforms that they're currently paying for, probably it's not the best idea to just decide I'm going to vibe code an accounting software. Or I don't want to use, my accounting software anymore. There's probably things you need to know about accounting software that the folks at Intuit and the Peachtree and all the other bigger ones know better than you.
Yeah.
So yeah,
And it's not a comparative advantage, right? I
yeah.
mean,
So, what should marketers be thinking about as they go through your State of Martech report and What are some highlights there that you want to bring to their attention?
Well, there are basically three parts to the report. So one is we do walk through the MarTech landscape and what changed, because it's been interesting to see which categories have been shrinking, which categories are growing. Um, but I think probably more relevant to marketers is we had done a study of 208 marketing ops leaders, sort of top quartile, marketing ops folks, of going through 70 use cases of AI in marketing. And for each one of them, like looking, hey, listen, are you using some AI capability built in an existing SaaS platform? Are you adopting a new AI native product? Are you building your own? Are you sort of rolling your own AI solution for this? And when we we set out to do that study, the thesis was like, oh, I wonder if they're going to be building here or buying here. And what was fascinating was across many of the use cases, the answer was yes. That it was these combinations where they're like, yep, yeah, we're using this inside this SaaS tool. Oh, we've got this other special product we brought in. Oh, we're kind of rolling our own capabilities here too. And I think that's somewhere between chaotic and maybe actually just the reality of where we're at right now is things are changing so fast that those marketers who really are in the top quartile, the marketing ops teams in the top quartile, they're just in a mode that they're like experimenting with a lot of these different things to figure out, okay, what works? What can we rely on? I would expect that to shake out over the next year, but right now it is, yeah, it's a little bit chaotic.
So do you feel like the folks are generally right sizing their investment into simultaneously experimenting on the one side and keeping their existing proven stack on the other side, or is that lopsided in one direction or the other?
Yeah, no, I think the way you frame that is exactly correct. Like it's a sort of a stratification where, we were talking earlier about the more infrastructure-y type MarTech platforms. Those are largely the existing SaaS platforms. Now those that are moving quickly, adopting, opening up things like MCP servers and whatnot to facilitate agents, seem to be doing really well. Um, but then on that layer of the infrastructure is then where you see people just doing all sorts of experimentation, whether it's firing something up with, frankly, just even like Claude Cowork or, Claude Code or a little bit of usage of things like Lovable and Replit. But to be honest, most of the experimentation we see people doing are actually just doing it with the products from the core AI labs themselves. Because let's face it, there's so much there, and it keeps coming, new stuff keeps shipping like every month. I mean, like it's a full-time job just trying to keep up with those.
Yeah. Do you feel like for folks who are waiting for the dust to settle before making those kinds of experimental moves and allocating experiment budget, do you feel like they're taking themselves at risk by not jumping in now? Because there are certain corporate cultures where they're like, oh no, the dust hasn't settled yet. New stuff is coming out all the time. I think it's been fascinating to see how quickly
Mhm.
Claude Code, for example, has evolved. But as I thought about it, it made perfect sense, right? Is AIs get better when they get a lot of feedback, and there's nothing like a million coders all saying, no, no, that's not what I wanted. And then it learns from each feedback loop that it goes through, right, in creating better code. And so it is now the time that folks should be investing, or will there be a dust settling moment in the next 6 months to a year where the more, conservative business can be like, okay, now I know what to do.
Yeah. Maybe, but I'm skeptical that the dust is going to settle anytime soon. And I think the concern I would have would be less about the implementation of production systems and more about falling behind in just like developing the skills and the mental models of how this stuff works. I mean, you can read all the articles you want. You can listen to all the podcasts you want. At the end of the day, the only way you really get a feel of what's possible and how this is changing is you kind of have to get hands-on. And so if you want to get hands-on a bit and do some experimentation, but you don't want to ship it into production, yeah, that very well, if you're a more conservative company, that very well may be the right call to make. But if you're just waiting to really like dip your toe in at all, I think you're on a serious risk of just being behind conceptually in how business is changing.
Yeah, it's interesting how you frame that because people ask me the same question about uh, GEO or AIO, right?
Mhm.
Which is well, most of the searches don't happen there yet. They're still happening with the Google SERP. And I said, well, what about your very best customers and prospects? Do you know what percentage of those that are going there, right? Because it doesn't
Mhm.
matter if recipe searchers are still going to Google if you don't sell to recipe, enthusiasts. And yet you're selling to a chief revenue officer or a chief information officer. And that's when the people go like, oh, I don't know the answer to that, right? And maybe I do need to invest. So it really it's going to be tough, I guess, for most folks to decide how much to invest in experimentation and exactly how they invest. Do you recommend that non-technical people experiment with Claude Code and Claude Design and some of the other tools just to sort of be able to speak the language of the development teams, as they ask for things?
Well, actually, this is one of the reasons I'm pretty impressed with Anthropic overall, is I think their Claude Cowork product is really ideal for non-technical people to start to experiment and learn this stuff because it's essentially the same underlying engine as Claude Code, but Claude Code you're working with command line interface. It can be going from the world that non-technical folks, were used to, diving deep in Claude Code maybe a bit of a leap, but Claude Cowork is like a great intermediary step there. And I think it gives you, as we were talking earlier about, just being able to get a feel for conceptually how this works, what it makes possible. That feels like the place to start. I haven't played a lot with Claude Design yet, although from what I've heard of people have, it's pretty wild, including hearing from people who like are professional designers. They're like, yeah, no, this is the way we could get these systems in place and we can collaborate through this. Um, your designer mileage may vary.
Yeah, it's interesting, it's a small data set, but I found that on the vibe coding side, it's made my best coders, you know, 20 times better. And
Mhm.
if there are people who are sort of intermediate, it only makes them 10 times better. Right. So there's some weird kind of thing that it amplifies what the best folks have. That may be true in the design side. I haven't really seen as much data there yet, or my teams really haven't been playing with it. But it seems like the ability for a really good coder to bend Claude Code to their will is greater, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if
I mean, I know a few folks who are like that, and it is actually crazy to watch them work because they've got like six different agents doing this stuff at the same time, and this agent's qualifying the other one, and I mean it's wild. But I think one thing I'd flag, by the way, with that is because sometimes there's this question of like, okay, well, is this going to do to marketing what it's doing to software engineering? And I think one of the things I would flag there is software engineering is what they call a very verifiable domain. Like the AI can build a program up against a spec, and then it can test it itself. And oh, if it doesn't work, it can retry it and debug it. And, it can sort of do those loops on its own to actually come to a state where it's like, yes, this is verified, correct, and working. As you know well, right? I mean, marketing, most things in marketing don't have that same degree of verifiability. Certainly not in a mode where you can be like, oh, well, let's keep sending emails to this customer until we finally get one that they respond to. Probably not a good idea. And actually, I think this is a great thing for marketers because it's one of the reasons why there's a lot of job security relative to other professions in this space is there is a human dynamic to this that you just can't turn over to autonomous AI. At least not based on anything of where we're at this stage.
Any other highlights to either the report or the technology landscape that you want to draw attention to, other than sort of the overall macro trends of, it flattening out or other, other macro ideas?
Well, I am going to nominate the Martech Word of the Year. I know it's only May, but I'm calling it is context because everybody is talking context, and part of what makes it a bit crazy is we're using context in many different ways that are not all perfectly compatible with each other. Like there's the context window for an AI assistant, like how much it can have in memory at one time. There's people talk about context engineering, almost like the, next generation of prompt engineering, where it's not just about instructions, it's about packaging up data and tools and all that. I'm not sure if you've heard the phrase started by one of these VCs back in December of context graphs. Of can we start to have AI that keeps track of how we make decisions in the company so that, it can bring greater and greater autonomy to that. Anyways, you just go down the list and it's context everywhere. And so one of the things we tried to do in the report was, first of all, just disambiguate a few of these different things. But at the same time, sort of recognize that I think this actually, for marketing operations people, really becomes where the work is going to be for these next several years because to get an agent or an agentic workflow or something like that to execute well, you can't just throw the kitchen sink at it. It just this doesn't work. It's not efficient. It's not cost effective. You really do need to be able to package up what is the relevant data instructions, tools for those different things. And while there are certainly infrastructure, like, we were talking earlier about these SaaS platforms that you can use as infrastructure to support that, it's not auto magical by any means at this time. And so in the report, we try and go a little bit deeper into like a framework of how people can think about this evolution of context engineering. But again, just like I feel marketers have a fairly bright future in this world, I feel people in marketing operations or go-to-market engineering or you pick your, ops tech engineering, title of the day. I feel they've got a tremendous career opportunity in front of them.
So, a follow-up question to that you got me thinking about, like, obviously hyper personalization of messaging, smaller segments, all of those things layer into best practices of marketing. Like if you can get the messaging right, then everything works better, right? Even the recipient of the message is happier. On the flip side, right, there's this balance of PII and privacy, not quite as much of a hot topic in B2B as it is in B2C. But do you feel like that sort of tug of war between privacy and relevancy has sort of finds a stable middle ground, under AI, where I can know sort of almost everything about you, I can, and therefore hyper personalized. But of course, you go across a certain line and it becomes too creepy, right? Because you're like, okay, I can sort of smell the creepiness of this messaging because it sort of knows too much about me. And do you feel like that's going to be something that happens along with this compute power and AI power that gets thrown into sales ops and rev ops and marketing ops?
Yeah, I think it is honestly a little bit of a dangerous ground for marketers because I feel like all sorts of AI maturity, not just for, those of us who are using AI, from a protection perspective, but those on the other end, just recipients, consumers, of AI. There's this, I think, pretty wide distribution curve of their familiarity and their comfort. And yeah, I think, boy, as a marketer, I would really want to understand my audience before I like go too far in that hyper personalization through AI because I think you're right. Depending on the audience, you could run a serious risk of creeping them the hell out. It's one of the reasons why, like, even as we start to see things like the generative video and whatnot, getting good, The technology, I think, will far past the boundary of being perfectly acceptable before like fully the social, cultural, comfort with that is going to fall. And so, while I know us marketers love to pioneer these things, I think that there should be a cautionary flag, of how these things are going to be received by your audience.
So let's talk about, you got me thinking a little bit about humanity, right? Because, you could, well, we could create facsimiles of each other, potentially even video facsimiles of each other. Those may not fly, in usability. But at the same time, we think about influencers and creators a lot more from the perspective of consumer facing products. But in the B2B world, there are some folks that are like really deep into CRM or really deep into other sub niches of account-based marketing, right? And they essentially become an influencer. And I would imagine that when it comes to the short list, that those influencers actually hold an outsized amount of power, right, as it relates to that, because it's their humanity, right, that
Mm.
almost raises them above the AI fray, right? The AI may tell me something, and then I may want to still get the point of view of this human dude or human woman who knows, like, it lives in the space, right? And so, is that an opportunity for those kinds of people as including yourself, right? Because you've lived and
Yeah,
breathed this
short
stuff,
answer is I
right?
sure hope so.
So do you feel like that the pendulum is actually swinging a little bit towards humanity from that perspective of, there's almost even the best AI it cannot necessarily be wise. It may be very intelligent, but it doesn't have the wisdom that comes with, experience that a human can bring to bear.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think at a like most meta level here, value almost always accrues to that which is scarce, And so as we've entered a world where like from an AI and, just pure digital creation perspective, like, all sorts of content and, increasing the experiences and all this stuff, eventually generative video can effectively be infinite, then it's no longer scarce, So what will become more and more valuable? Those things that are scarce, that I can't just get an infinite amount on demand. I think is one of the reasons why you've seen a rise in in-person events of all kinds. I mean, part of it is we're finally coming back from the pandemic dark days, but even more of like these like smaller group dinners, whether they're done by a vendor or they're done by like little associations or interest groups, they've been taking off like crazy because people are craving, like, yeah, yeah, yeah. I know I can ask the AI a million questions and it's more than happy to, spew things at me all day long. I want to talk to another human being and I want to sort of lean across the table and like ask them what they really think about something. And yeah, I think your point here about this idea of trusted influencers, voices, people like, okay, I know this is a human. I know their style. It's like I trust them. Um, and maybe that's even like a whole nother topic there of just boy, trust. I mean, that's kind of riffing off of, the discussion we were just having there about yeah, just because you can hyper personalize things or all this, like, should you? I mean, a lot of it just comes down to the fact of, yeah, do people trust you? And as marketers, boy, it kind of feels like we really should be the guardians of trust for our brands.
Yeah, I guess we're the guardians, and increasingly events are definitely back. I am an investor in events.com because I do believe like platforms to facilitate events of all kinds will continue to be really important. And I was just recently at three events back to back, right, including one that was on a cruise ship, Summit at Sea. And even when there's the human who's very knowledgeable, I find that people listening to that individual, they're okay if there's a bias, right? As long as that person's bias is sort of somewhat obvious, right? There are people who come, let's say, from the HubSpot world versus who come from the Salesforce world, right? And they have their slight preferences. It's almost a little bit religious, right? Like Mac versus PC and other areas like that. But as long as I do think there's such a value to the conversations that occur face to face at events that I was sort of somewhat even though I was betting on events, I was still positively surprised that the possible conference almost doubled
Yeah.
from last year, right in 1 year. So that there's definitely an appetite for in-person. I guess to some extent, it's almost the hypothesis that if a company could afford to be there at the event, they must be more legit. Like they were willing to invest
Mhm.
time to sponsor that dinner or to sponsor that yacht or to have that big booth or to have that big presence. And that's sort of a like, okay, it's not a fly-by-night organization. They flew in 5 people or 10 people or 15 people to a conference. Um, and that just puts them on the radar, I think, a little bit more than it would be if somebody's got no physical, event presence.
Yeah, exactly. The fact that AI is making it cheaper and cheaper to like, oh, I want a phenomenal looking website, bam, done. Yeah, then the website is no longer the signal of like, yeah, no, we're legit. We've invested a lot in this. Yeah, it's a really great point. What are the other ways you signal legitimacy, expertise, yeah, dependability?
Yeah, well, case studies and testimonials obviously continue to be super important. Not to mention the fact that they help GEO, not just SEO. So, for those folks listening, I highly recommend everyone revisit their strategy as it relates to co-creation of content with your customers, right?
Mm,
Because
amen to that.
it's that has the trust element. It's unique content. It's verifiable, etc. So a lot of stuff. What else should marketing teams be thinking about this year that perhaps they didn't think about last year?
Oh, man, I think the main thing would be is if you haven't been experimenting with it's not just like the vibe coding, it's even just like developing like if you're using Claude, getting good at creating skills, experimenting with things like co-work where you like have it do more work on your behalf from like a data analysis perspective. I mean, it just feels like these skills, sorry, I'm now overloading the term skills. Like the fluency of being able to like really use these AI tools, even again, just like the base Claude, ChatGPT, Gemini. I mean, you could spend 24/7 just really digging into that and still probably only scratch the surface. But I think it's one of those things that as marketers, maybe you didn't need to think about this a lot last year. I feel like this year, if you aren't taking time to like understand this stuff, get hands-on, develop it a bit, and again, it's not necessarily about even trying to get this stuff into like, oh, and we're going to overhaul our entire, production system here. It's just being able to keep current or maybe in a glass half empty sort of thing, not fall so far behind that you're out of touch of how this actually works. Because I mean, I'm genuinely surprised. Like, it's hard to believe what you can do today relative to like what this stuff was at a year ago. And even a year ago, it seemed pretty impressive, but now it's almost like a toy box. I mean, heaven forbid, like what it's going to look like over the next year. It's somewhere between like exhausting and terrifying and exciting and
Yeah, I hope that folks in the world of academia actually hear this as well, right? Because I do notice, I see it more from the perspective of interviewing potential interns for my nonprofit or the e-marketing foundation.
Mm,
But some professors are very anti-AI, and as a result, their graduating class is not as fluent in AI
mhm,
as they should be, right? And I feel like that's a headwind that they're going to face. And this is less so on the technical side. I do think the CS computer science folks have been, realized, okay, if I can't pair code with Claude, then what am I going to do as a job? But on the liberal arts side, I do feel like, and I don't know if it's the professor's fault or whose fault it is necessarily, but I do feel like academia has sort of potentially dropped the ball in preparing the graduating classes for, what work looks like now in most marketing professions, whether that's earned media or paid media. I don't know if you agree.
yeah, 100%. And I mean, even more broadly, it's just again like people got an initial exposure to this stuff 2 or 3 years ago, and they formed an opinion in their head of like, oh yeah, no, this is just what someone does to cheat on their homework. And they've not actually paid attention to how this has evolved since then. So they're sort of out of touch of what's possible. I mean, my goodness, I don't know how much you do this. But anytime I'm trying to learn something new, like having ChatGPT or Claude like tutor me and interactive and quiz me and oh my goodness, there's like a education learning capability here that is almost mind-boggling unto itself. And so yeah, it's a bit of a crime that you still have in a lot of educational circles them thinking like, ah, nah, they shouldn't do this. We want to make sure you can
Right.
do this without AI. And while there's some level which I get that thing, I think to be exclusively on that end and not recognize like, oh my goodness, like this is such an unlock for what we can empower these students to do. Um, yeah,
Yeah,
there's a gap.
for sure. Any closing thoughts on what marketers or sales ops or rev ops people should do for the next year?
Well, take a deep breath. The other thing I think a lot of us are seeing or feeling ourselves is just also a bit of AI exhaustion. Running at this just constant crazy pace of new things coming at us so fast, so frequently. Yeah, it's exciting, but it is really exhausting, and I don't think it's entirely sustainable that way. And so I just feel like for all of our sanity, taking the occasional day to just like shut it down and go walk on some grass or sit at the beach. I think it's just a certain amount that's going to be healthy for us to build into this process to be able to, yeah, keep up with what's happening in the world.
Great. Well, thanks, Scott, for sharing your wisdom. Great to catch up and a lot for folks to process. It's changing so fast. They should take a deep breath, I guess, and hopefully the podcast will help them reprioritize.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for having me back, Kevin.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.